Matt Wilson. I'm an associate professor of geography in the College of Arts and Sciences. The unit that I teach in the Gaines program is just called mapping. And it's largely an exploration of different forms of map making practices, as well as broader histories of map making, especially as they relate to the mapping of Lexington, Kentucky, and thinking about Lexington as a city. Our module, which is titled Mapping, comes to that theme, is really thinking about the role of visualization technologies and representational practices as they relate to the settling of Kentucky and indeed the development of Lexington from the late 18th century onward as a city. Students work with original materials, thinking about the platting of Lexington in 1780 when Lexington was still a part of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and tracking that forward through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow South, as mapping becomes an instrument, not only for understanding how life was lived in Lexington, but also mapping as a kind of tool for governance. And students will explore in this module how mapping is central to the way we organize ourselves today. In this module, in this unit, the students begin with a fairly simple exercise. I have them read an academic article written by Professor Rich Shine, who's in the College of Arts and Sciences. And it's an article on what he calls the racial morphology of cities. And he uses Lexington as a case study in understanding racial morphology. The argument of the piece is that you can look at representational technologies like plats and maps, and they will help you understand the broader political economics of urban development. So in the students' first assignment, they read this article, and they go on what I call a map walk. And so this is a predefined walk that relates to different aspects of the article written by Shine. And the students actually have to walk to a part of Lexington in North Lexington called the Hampton Court Gate. And they look at this gate, which was constructed around 1905, and they think about its site and situation, which is a common way in which geographers tend to think about spatial study. So they go on a walk, they take pictures, they then actually engage in some very quick illustration and diagramming of what they see in Hampton Court Gate, and they bring that back to the classroom for us to discuss in the module. The opportunity of the Gaines Fellowship and the opportunity that comes with teaching in these modules is to work with students who may have a curiosity or an experience of the humanities, but may not know exactly how that gets disciplined or how that gets sort of formalized in training. The opportunity of the module is to do that in a very short period of time. So as a faculty member, it can be challenging because you're wanting to cover so much territory, thematic ground, with these students who are very capable and quite frankly, some of the more curious students you will encounter as an educator. So the opportunity of Gaines is an exciting one, but it can be challenging in the sense that you have to figure out how to do justice to your various areas of expertise in a short period of time. In the wider angle view of this, we'd like to think that students come out of this modular-based experience with a more synthetic understanding of a variety of different ways of practicing the humanities. And I think the module on mapping that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of is a great example of trying to showcase all the ways in which spatial thinking and spatial representation impacts the way we live and work in everyday ways.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Holden, and I'm an assistant professor in the History and African American and Africana Studies departments. My unit for the Gaines Center was had a focus on multidisciplinary methodologies. We focused on race in the contemporary South and really walked through ways that students can use methodologies from a number of different disciplines to answer the questions that they have about this really complex history and present. One of the first things we did in class was get out a map, a fifth grade social studies map, and try to find the South together. And what quickly became apparent during the exercise was that everybody in the class, some of our Gaines students self-identify as Southerners, some did not. had trouble agreeing on exactly where the South is. So once we started from a place of realizing that saying the words contemporary South brought up very different geographical definitions for everyone, we could move forward picking apart what each student really thought was at the core of Southernness, and what made a place or a person or a foodway or a cultural marker Southern. So one of the things that became apparent is because so many different markers and characteristics led people to identify someone or something as Southern, having a multidisciplinary approach allowed each student to pick apart the characteristic that they found the most important in defining Southernness. So in my unit, I wanted to make sure that students had a chance to work with contemporary authors from the contemporary South, or talking about the issues that we cared about. So we read Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which is subtitled American Lyric, and worked through the really different forms that Rankine uses in that book to express different truths about contemporary race and contemporary race relations in the US. And then we read one of my favorite Southern authors, Jesmyn Ward's The Men We Reached, which for them really proved to be a work that allowed them to work through structural versus interpersonal racism. And it really led to a really fruitful discussion of contemporary realities in the Deep South and the Gulf South. They also had to do presentations that combined at least two of their fields of study to discuss a contemporary issue in the US South. Students were asked to make sure their presentations engaged beyond your regular old PowerPoint. So they did everything from bring in bread from a local, very Southern fast food restaurant to working through a dance routine to Beyonce in Beyonce's tribute to historically Black colleges and universities, to really have tactile ways that they were explaining what they meant by Southernness. While most of my unit was discussion based, we also did a number of exercises. And I think maybe one of the most effective exercises was a timeline exercise where I asked students to map on a timeline important events in their life, and then to come together to try and see if we could come up with a class timeline that we could all agree on for a certain period of time. It helps students not only explore what each of them was bringing to the classroom in terms of their own ideas about America's recent past, but it also helped us talk through the ways that scholars assign significance, that different disciplines assign significance in different ways, that different methodological approaches highlight particular things about a history, a past, a present, and it really made for a very fruitful icebreaker that moved beyond, more rote, trust falls or human knots, to get down to the kind of the nitty gritty. I had the privilege of being the first faculty member to engage them. So some of what we were doing was also a little bit of group exploration and group bonding to help them out as they approached each unit that came after mine. What the Gaines Seminar offers is really a unique intellectual community on campus, and the students I had the privilege of working with really did approach the experience building to build a unique intellectual community. They really reveled in and appreciated their diverse perspectives, and it was really refreshing to have a classroom of students who I could say, hey, read this book, and they would. And then they'd find ways to talk to each other about it before we spoke in class. And I have a great time teaching students in other environments at UK, but one of the things that's really unique is how Gaines students really buy into a fruitful intellectual experience. And they really did. They had a range of majors. They were a part of very different campus communities. They had very different extracurricular profiles. But in the space of the seminar, they were there to really engage each other and engage new, different ideas. It reminded me a lot of my liberal arts college experience, an experience where it wasn't odd for biology majors to have theater minors, for example. And it allowed for that kind of collaborative learning in an environment where students were not really preoccupied with evaluation and were much more preoccupied with exploration.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Kramer. I'm Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of Linguistics in the College of Arts and Sciences. And my unit was on linguistic perceptions in the South. And basically the whole section of the course was devoted to issues related to language in the South, not only how people perceive it, but also the sort of real life living language of the South and how people are actually using language, what things are stereotypes, how those stereotypes come about, and how we speak is a really intricate part of who we are. That was the main focus of our unit. So in my unit, we were talking about language in modern day Southern United States. We focused on how people actually produce language. That is, what are the sounds that they make that are common among Southern dialects and Southern accents? What are the words they use that differentiate Southern speech from other varieties of American English? And what are the grammatical structures that they use? This is a more structural approach to language. In my unit, one of the things I like to do with all of my classes, anytime I teach a class to non-linguists, people just finding out what linguistics is, we always start out with a crash course in linguistics, a very quick, here are the nuts and bolts of what you need to know to be able to talk reasonably about language use. And so the first thing I have them do is to think about their own linguistic autobiography. We all live in and amongst language, languages, dialects, varieties, and so forth. And I asked them to think critically about the kinds of language influences on their lives. After our crash course, we moved into some of the specifics of language in the South. And so I had them think a little bit about what it looks like in our linguistic landscape is what we say. Basically, when you go out into the world and you see language, written language on signs, on shops, on shirts, what kinds of things are we seeing? And so this was a photo project. The students had to go out and take pictures of their linguistic landscape and try to find me something remotely Southern. We got lots of pictures of people wearing y'all shirts, basically, is a lot of what we saw. And this was a new experiment for me with students. I wanted to see what they would find out there. I know I see it, but the question is, do you see evidence that we have sort of a Southern linguistic identity in the Lexington area? We also had a perceptual component of the class. So I asked students, my particular area of research is called perceptual dialectology. Basically, I give people maps and I ask people to tell me how people talk in these maps. So they circle areas and they label those areas. And then if I give you a map of the whole United States, inevitably somebody's going to circle a large chunk of the Southeast and they're going to call it the South. Or worse, they're going to call it hick, hillbilly, redneck, and some really other awful things. We talked about that research that exists, and then I had them do it with their families. They went home. This was around Thanksgiving, so they went home over Thanksgiving and they had their families do this map task and talk about the attitudes people had towards Southern varieties. And so they had a chance to actually ask the people they know and love, hey, here's a map. And they'd circle the South and they'd say, you know, how pretty is this way of speaking, or how educated is this way of speaking? A lot of the students told me that this was pretty eye-opening because they've never really asked these kinds of questions of their family members. And so they were getting to see a different side of who their parents or their grandparents or their cousins were, for better or for worse. We wrapped up the semester talking about just general perceptions of Southern language, building off of what they had learned in that exercise. And we finished up with just a final project on kind of a current events project, where I had students just tell me a little bit about something that they had learned about what linguistics was. They learned about linguistic perception and production, and they just had to go out and say, what kinds of things are the media talking about? And we ended on that note where we just kind of said, why is this relevant for contemporary society? How does language even figure in? And what we learned here help us in understanding those issues out in the world? Teaching the Gaines Fellows is probably one of the most rewarding experiences in teaching that I've had at the University of Kentucky. I love all my students, and I've had a chance to teach across the university. I've had students from many different colleges of varying levels, and the Gaines students are clearly a special group of students. And it's not just about academics. It's more than that. The students are obviously very smart, but what's exciting about teaching them, especially since I had them pretty well into their cohorting, is that they are a cohort. They are a unit. They build off of each other. They build each other up. And I think that the experience from their perspective is obviously a good one, because they have this strong support network of peers. But from my perspective, in the front of the classroom, this was not like teaching a room full of new faces, even though they were completely new to me. It was like teaching this little group of people who were already engaged in the same kinds of thought processes and challenging each other and bringing new experiences in. And that part of teaching for Gaines was really invigorating.
I'm Melissa Stein. I am faculty in gender and women's studies, but I'm a historian by training. And the title of my unit was Ghosts of the Past. And one of the reasons that I titled this is because I wanted to have students think critically about memory and how we remember the past, and how the past shapes the present, and how we view the past is shaped by our contemporary concerns or interests as well. So this kind of dynamic relationship between past and present, and the way that the past haunts us or is kind of present in all sorts of different ways. So we looked at literature. We read, so I divided the course into two basic sections. One, we looked at the challenges of doing the history of sexuality. So the challenges for historians, things like silences in the archives, having to read between the lines of sources, of knowing that certain sources probably weren't saved or might have been destroyed if they portrayed people in a negative light. You know, family members may have destroyed particular sources. The fact that we don't always record our most intimate thoughts about our most intimate lives. So how do we construct a history of sexuality of the past? And then the other section was on the history of slavery as another challenge for historians. And that is, again, a challenge of sources, that we have a lot of source material from slave owners about how they thought about slavery and the day-to-day practices of managing a plantation or a small farm. But we don't have a lot of sources from the perspectives of the slaves themselves. And those that we do have are often colored by years of new memories and things like that. They're interviews with former slaves that were taken decades after the fact, when they're much older. We ended the unit with the book Beloved, and looking at how how the past literally becomes embodied as a ghost that haunts the house. So the legacy of slavery becomes embodied in this ghost that haunts the descendants, right? And use that as a way to think more figuratively about history. And the students, interestingly, thought that that unit gave them that particular reading gave them the best sense of what slavery was like, the source that was actually a piece of fiction, more so than some of the historical documents that gave you kind of very small snippets or specific perspectives. They thought this kind of very interior focused narrative from Toni Morrison gave them the best sense of what it was like. Okay, so this was a really fun class to teach as a historian, but getting to teach a broad group of students and get them to play with sources and experience different kinds of primary sources. So most of my assignments were geared around, you know, having a small set of primary documents or images for students to understand the kind of work that historians do. But the sources were really varied. So for example, they looked at, they had a in-class exercise where we looked at anti-venereal disease posters from World War I and World War II, and looked at the kinds of visual cues in these images. And I always start with something visual because students are really interested in reading visual sources. And what messages, you know, public health campaigners were conveying about gender, about sexuality, about foreignness, about patriotism, all of these different things in these images. And then we turn to, you know, more textual sources as well. So they had short writing assignments and discussions about these different sources and what the challenges were of reading them. And one of the most fun things we got to do was go on a walking tour of Lexington itself. So we did a walking tour with Jonathan Coleman, who was a PhD, who received his PhD in history here at UK. And he has created these walking tours of LGBT history. So it tied into our section on the challenges of doing the history of sexuality. So the students by then had read about the challenges of looking at sexuality in archival materials, and then got to walk around the physical space of Lexington and see how all these buildings or intersections that they walk past every day or never think twice about have these long histories from the history of sexuality in Lexington, and they found that really fascinating, and it was a really fun thing to do. I personally think that the Gaines seminar is one of the best things at the University of Kentucky. I've already signed up for another round of teaching with Gaines because it was one of the most engaging and fun teaching experiences I've had. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility. There's both the space and resources to allow things like field trips and trips to archives and to think really broadly about what you're doing with the students. And then the cherry on top is that you have these students that really want to be there, are really engaged and excited. They all seem very quickly to have very strong bonds with each other. So it's the best context I've ever had for assigning group work, group exercises, group projects, because they have already coalesced as a group or a series of smaller groups. So you have students that really are engaged and want to do the work and have thoughtful responses to what they're learning.